Well, very good evening and welcome to this beautiful spring evening here in the city of Melbourne. So thanks for joining me. It's lovely to have your company again for another Tuesday night live. If you're watching this live, or of course, if you're watching or listening to it as a podcast during the week, I welcome you. Now, if you are watching this live, you can pop a comment into the feed on Facebook or YouTube, and that will come up for me here. And if you got any comments, got any questions at all, especially for my special guest tonight, feel free to fire those at him sometime through the night. Now, my guest this evening is Professor Rikk Watts, or Dr. Rikk Watts. Rikk actually spoke in the early days at Bayside Church when we were still in the funeral parlour, W.D. Rosenstone's funeral chapel. I think it was 92 or maybe 1993. And then he spent some time in Vancouver, quite a long time actually, at Regent College, came back to Australia for a little while and is shortly to head back to Vancouver. But it's an absolute delight to have Rikk with me tonight. And so without any further ado, let's add him to the stream. Welcome to the studio. Hi, Rikk.
Thank you very much. And I'm sure when I was at the funeral parlour, I probably contributed to many of those falling asleep as though dead.
I always say, the Bayside was the church where everybody was welcome. So,
Gee. Okay. Don't give up your daytime job. Is that what they say? Is that the right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. All the dad jokes about that time, God was undertaking for us and all of those sorts of things.
No.
I've used them all over the years, Rikk, but they still get a good chuckle occasionally. So
I think I'm going to need healing after hearing this.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, well, we have a healing ministry at Bayside, so soon as we're here, I'll give you the link to them and they can pray for you. So,
fantastic.
Joking aside, it is lovely to have your company tonight, and thank you for giving us an hour. Now, are you in Sydney or Melbourne?
Well, I'm actually in Sydney right now, so summer's a little more upon us than down south. It's very nice.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've been now 18 days in a row COVID-free, which I am so excited about, and I know my fellow Melbourneites are also, pretty chuffed about that. And right now, of course, we're praying for the folk in South Australia. I think just reminds us how infectious this virus is that we're dealing with, and none of us should be proud during dealing with a global pandemic. So, I want to pray for them at the moment. How have you been impacted, or have you been impacted at all by COVID-19 and the lockdowns and everything this year?
Well, most of my work had been done before COVID made its presence known. I had a few trips planned I was looking forward to. So Katie and I were planning to go to Scandinavia for a couple of weeks. Right. And we also had a conference in the UK I was hoping to go to, and a visit to Brazil. I've got good friends there. And summer school at Regent in Vancouver, and all of those went by the way, of course. So,
yeah.
But apart from that, we haven't been really impacted that much. We were able to go back to church a little earlier, even though we're still doing the 4-metre rule. So I think, all in all, we really haven't suffered that much, I'm afraid.
Okay. Well, I mean, I'm glad to hear that. I mean, it's been a different story for many people down here, of course, in the city of Melbourne. But we are enjoying our newfound freedoms and coming out the other side, which is really delightful. So, Rikk, just give us a little bit of your background, because you have qualification in aerospace as well as theology. Tell us about that.
Oh, well, yes. I'm rather confused, I think. So I grew up loving aircraft, and I decided to become an aeronautical engineer. I wanted to be a pilot, but I've got a damaged left eye, so that wasn't going to work. So I couldn't fly the things. At least I get to build them, I thought. Then I discovered, to my horror, it was all about mathematics. I used to draw these wonderful pictures, and then underneath this is complex math. So my dad said to me, listen, you need to finish what you started, at least get a degree under your belt, which I did. But even toward the end of that, I started I've been introduced to apologetics. Schaeffer, what was his name?
Francis Schaeffer.
Francis Schaeffer, I should know that. I began to meet some people outside the Pentecostal tradition in Scripture Union. A very good friend who was part of the Anglican Church, opened up my horizons immensely. And that got me interested in apologetics and history. So I ended up I did a few years of work. Then I went to La Trobe Uni to do art history, sociology and philosophy, do that side of things.
Yep.
And I was working with IBM at that point. Then I met John Smith, got involved with him and worked as his secretary for a while. So that was a wonderful experience, actually, to see the way John could integrate the gospel to the culture so effortlessly almost.
Yeah, amazing.
And out of that came this larger question, which we'll probably get to tonight. Here I was, an aeronautical engineer, and having grown up in the Pentecostal tradition, not to say that this is not the case in others, but specifically in mine, a real sense of God's presence and reality for sure. But I just could not work out for the life of me what that had to do with turbofans at 30,000 feet. Right? And so in many ways, my life journey's been about working through that. So I met Katie, Anglican, at Truth and Liberation Concern. We worked in a crisis accommodation house, Montrose House it was known for a number of years, working with teenagers off the streets or housewives from violent situations, abusive situations. And that led to going to Gordon Commonwealth. I did some study there under Gordon Fee, actually, which was great.
Oh, wonderful. Amazing man.
Oh, absolutely. Very sharp, thoughtful, but known for his deep love for Jesus.
Yeah.
Regularly weeping in class. People used to joke that he could teach a class on textual criticism, which is a very technical manuscript-oriented exercise, and still have an altar call and have half the class down the front in tears, right? Without any sense of dislocation. So that was lovely. And from that to a little place in England, I did my doctorate, and then back to BCV, now MST, in Melbourne for about 6 years. And then Gordon asked me to join him at Regent, and I was there for 21 years. So
wonderful.
interesting mix of history.
The little place in England, that happened to be Cambridge, did it not?
Yeah.
So nice little humble understatement there, Rick. So
well, it's a humble place, known for it.
Right. So we had a great conversation yesterday, and really out of that conversation, I've got some questions that I'd love to ask you tonight, and I do want to say hi to some of the people that are watching. G'day to Rachel and Katie, Alice. You might remember Charles and Alice Wooderson around.
I know those names, yes, I do.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Charles is rejoicing in heaven these days, but Alice turned 90 this year. She's part of Bayside Church and still a vibrant member and minister of our church. G'day to Grant, Deborah from WA. Hello. Chris and Tom and Kerry. So nice to have you guys with us tonight. And Katie, who says that her husband became a Christian through Dr. Schaefer, through Francis ministry. Yeah,
excellent.
Wonderful.
Forgetting his name, I do apologise.
No, that's okay. We all have mental blanks occasionally. The funniest one happened to me last week. I was talking about my mum, and she passed away a few years ago from dementia. And I talked about a particular song that I used to play to her that really connected the dots for her when she couldn't remember a lot of other things. And then I went completely blank on the name of the song. So I'm like, what a dreadful moment to have a mental blank.
I bet you planned that. That was just wonderful.
Oh, I mean,
great
it was
writing.
a bit embarrassing actually. So, but I remember the name of the song is actually "Love's Old Sweet Song," and it was a massive hit in the 40s. And my mum loved it. And whenever I played that, it would just bring her out of the dementia right back into reality again. So it was quite an incredible story. Now, you mentioned to me yesterday a guy called Tom Holland, who wrote a piece called "Why I Was Wrong About Christianity." Give us the background to that, Rick.
Right. Well, I'm just going to relate to you what Tom himself said. He grew up in an English public school. That's where he had his education. And of course, they would do their Jerusalem and the Anglican thing, just the public form of state religion, if you like. He wasn't very impressed. He was much more excited by dinosaurs, as we all were, younger, right? And of course, they were ferocious and very impressive and extinct. And as he got older, that shifted to a different group of people the Romans and the Greeks, who were likewise kind of impressive, but also ancient and extinct. And the more he got into that world, the more he began to realize that just like a Tyrannosaurus Rex is one thing in a children's book, it's something very different face to face, 6 feet away. And as he began to look at the Greco-Roman world, he was stunned by its inhumanity, actually. I think when Caesar goes to Gaul to get glory and renown, 1 million people die as a result of that invasion, 250,000 left without homes to face an oncoming winter. And really no one batted an eyelid. There were a few people who were upset about the brutality of it. Mostly it was about his own aggrandizement. He sold, I think, another 1 million into slavery and shared the proceeds with his troops, kept most of it for himself, I think. And no one really batted an eyelid, ultimately. And Holland began to realize that this culture, this ancient world that he'd idealized in many ways, was utterly foreign to him. And it was in that encounter that he realized that he was actually far more Christian than anything else in terms of his morality. So he would say in the ancient world, leaders would impose their will by making others suffer. But in the gospel, it's Jesus who suffers. Utterly foreign to the way the world would think. Then he goes on to say that even in the modern world, most of us, so-called in this post-Christian world, still think it's more honourable to suffer than to cause others to suffer. So he just makes the point that so much of what we take for granted in the Western world about caring for one another, having compassion, those things are fundamentally Christian. They really don't come from anywhere else. Now, that's a shock to some people. And of course, if you ever talk to people about these things, you realise that we're not as objective as we like to think we are. You get to some of those issues and, people get quite responsive, their emotions, obviously, if you believe something, there'll be emotions involved. So you sometimes find there's quite a bit of pushback on that. It may not be terribly reasonable, but it just, because it's touching something so deep in people's hearts. And I think it's hard for many modern people to admit that we might be a profoundly Christian culture. We might come to that a little bit later on and ask why that is.
Yeah, absolutely. We will come back to that. I think it's fascinating. Obviously, there's a whole lot of packaging maybe that goes with Christianity, goes with the church in this day and age, which is not overly endearing. But I think, I often will say to people, the world is actually getting better. And you only the people who say the world's getting worse and worse and worse and worse and worse don't have any context of history, I think. But when you start reading about people, as you say, Julius Caesar, who we know is a great conqueror who died in the middle of March, and that's pretty well it. But a lot of the stuff he did was incredibly brutal, and you've already outlined that. You've got another couple of quotes here. Rodney Stark concluded it was the early Christians who gave the ancient world for the first time its humanity. And Australia's own Mark Strom traced Paul's uncompromising challenge to ancient notions of personhood and social hierarchies, which challenge has shaped Australian society to a degree perhaps unmatched in the rest of the world.
Yes. Yeah. Surprised?
So, no, I'm. But so what you're saying is that that modern society, or at least Western society, is inherently Christian, whether we like to admit it or not. Absolutely.
And two things to say about that. We'll come back to the first one. It has to do with what we think is Christian. And we'll come back to that point. I think it's an important one. But just to pick up on Rodney Stark, so he began his work as a sociologist, and if you know anything about North American sociology, it doesn't tend to be friendly toward Christian belief at all. And as he was doing his work, he thought, it's very strange that most sociologists think of religion as an epiphenomenon, just something that floats on the surface, doesn't really have an impact. And he couldn't believe that. He thought, no, we've had this Christian thing in the West for 2,000 years. Surely it's got to have had some impact. So he wrote a book called The Rise of Early Christianity, and he writes it as an outsider. He's not a Christian at this point. I'm giving it away. He becomes one eventually. So he doesn't always get what makes us work. He's an outsider. Sometimes I think he makes some assumptions and draws some conclusions that don't quite reflect what we're doing. But the overall geography, I think he's got right. And he just concludes by making that extraordinary statement. What the early Christians gave the ancient world was its humanity. And I think in some ways that's unquestionable, actually. What Mark Strong does, I think he's written one of the best books on Paul, actually, Reframing Paul. And he puts Paul back in the social context where it's all about hierarchy. It's all about the great leader who's being honored all the time. And, the masses are there to honor the great one and to fuel their projects as they build monuments of their own, all this kind of thing. And Paul will have nothing to do with that, which really only makes sense if he really did encounter a crucified God. That just turns his world upside down. Here's a God who doesn't care anything for those kinds of hierarchical gains. And 2 Corinthians is one of the best letters, I think, in terms of this. When I teach it, I often describe it as Paul and the Hellenistic great one. And there are all these beliefs about how great one should be. They wall themselves off from those around them. They have bearing, they have status. They rarely take advice because that shows they're too pliable. They never really change their minds, or what I decide, this is where we're going to go. And Paul refuses to have anything to do with it. So he begins 2 Corinthians by talking about his sufferings. No one would do that in antiquity. Nobody, right? How many modern pastors would start there? You might wonder.
Well, no.
And he says, I'm not here to lord it over your faith. I'm meant to be a worker together with you for your joy. What a wonderful definition of what it means to be a leader.
Yeah.
A worker together with you for your joy, right? And anyway, so Mark looked at that, and I think, I've forgotten his name, the Macquarie professor of church history, has just published a couple of books on Christianity in Australia. I should know that name, but and he argues, and I think quite persuasively, that of all the countries that are currently existent, Australia is probably the most Christian in terms of founding of any. So evangelicals, and that's why we have this deep distrust of hierarchy.
Wow, isn't that, it's stunning, isn't it? And yet, of course, if you were to say that to the average Aussie, we're an incredibly Christian country, a lot of people would completely disagree with you.
Yeah. And it might be worth asking why that is.
Well, I was about to. Hey, Rick, why is that?
Oh, what a great question. Should have thought that myself. Well, we might get to this. One of the things I think that Genesis gives to the world, and I know people have huge debates about how you treat the 7 days, and okay, that's a fun discussion to have. I think we miss the most remarkable insight, which is that creation is not perfect, it's good.
Yep. And
in fact, many Christians think creation is meant to be perfect, but you don't want to live in a perfect world, because in a perfect world, nothing can change. The moment it changes, it's no longer perfect, right? So if you live in a perfect world, that means humans have no agency whatsoever. There's nothing you can do to change anything. And it just goes round and round and round, this kind of cyclical pattern. What you think is change is nothing but just repetition over and over again. And there are Greeks who thought that. But Genesis says, no, the world's not perfect. It's good. And that's a huge shift, because in a good world, things can change. And that gives an enormous space for humans to do things. Now, once you're thinking like that, where humans are agents of change, then the next question is, what drives that change in us? And Rob, that's where I think character is so important.
Yeah.
And I suspect one of the reasons why Christianity is not held in high regard is because sometimes we're pompous, we're self-righteous, we don't know how to speak about the truth in a gracious way. So sometimes we just stop speaking about the truth unless it's popular.
Yep.
We're not known as people who are about trying to bring life to others. We've got all these other things going on, and now we can talk about this a bit more later on. But I think one of the real problems, if I can say this, is and gently, and I'm speaking about myself first of all, I think many Christians really have no idea who Jesus was. It's an awful sweeping statement, I know, and that's going to vary from denomination to denomination depending on who teaches in your church. But I think that's one of the reasons people like Tom Wright, for example, are so popular. And he's not the first, but a bunch of people, I guess, beginning in the 50s and up through the 60s of last century. Can I say that, last century? Really began to focus on Jesus as a first century Jew. He's an extraordinary, just amazing, amazing figure. So
why don't you give us give us some insights then about that statement that, you know, Jesus is not the man that we think he is. What is Jesus like? And I ask this for two reasons. First of all, I really want an answer for the people watching. The other thing is I'm starting a new series at Bayside this weekend called Like Jesus. So my question is, what was Jesus like? Because if we're called as his followers to be like him, we need to know what he was like. So what would you say?
Yeah, you understand that it's a great question. It took 4 Gospels to try and explain that to us. Okay?
Yes,
we're going to do that in 30 seconds, not. But the first thing I want to say is you really can't separate Jesus from his Jewish history. And this now is going to be a little controversial. I'm quite nervous about theology. People who know me will know that. And the reason is, it's not because I don't think we should think about God. I think we should think very carefully about God. But theology is not actually a Christian word. It's a Greek word. And it's the rational science of God. Now, read the Gospels and tell me how you get rational science out of those. You don't. And basically what it meant was you end up creating God in terms of what we think perfection looks like. And they're looking for that which doesn't change. That's what really matters to the Greeks. If something changes, it can't be true. So you want something that doesn't change. If you're not careful, you end up with a very abstract God, and all kinds of things flow out of that. He's got everyone's actions planned in advance, etc. All those kinds of things just tumble down, they cascade from this. But that's not what we get in the Gospels. We get history, or what the Greeks would call hysteria, which is, you know, because you've seen and you've borne witness. Now, they didn't like history generally because it changed. But you can understand from a Jewish point of view, no, change is the gift. So if you're going to learn about God and people, you have to look at what they do in various situations. And that's what you see in the Gospels. You get to see what Jesus is like. And behind that, I want to say, Jesus is not just the Messiah. Before that, he's actually Yahweh among us. That's another discussion.
He's what, sorry?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I missed that last statement.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm talking too quickly. Lots of people will talk about Jesus as the Son of God, which he is. They'll talk about him as the Messiah, and he's that too. But before any of that, he's actually Israel's Yahweh among us.
Right.
And that's important because you can use the word God, but if you're going to be faithful to the scriptures of Israel, Yahweh occurs far more frequently than God. And why Yahweh? Because that's where God reveals himself at the Exodus. That's his character. That's what they see being revealed when they come out of Egypt. Abraham didn't see that. That's what you get at the Exodus. And that's what you're seeing in Jesus. You're actually getting to see what God is like. So all of those little narratives in the Gospels that tell you, right, you can't forgive sins. Well, actually, yes, I can. Well, only God can do that. Right? And that's what God wants to do.
Yeah.
And if you've seen that series, The Chosen, had a look at that.
No, I haven't. No.
I think it's worth having a look at. I think they've really captured something about Jesus' character. Turning water into wine at a wedding. I understand alcoholism can be a problem. I get that. But this is a small village wedding, and it's 6 jars, probably 120 gallons of the best wine anybody's ever had. Who's going to drive these people home afterwards? Right? And that's how John begins his gospel. That's got to tell you something about the character of this God to whom we've come.
Yeah, yeah.
So that could be expanded quite, further, and we don't really have time to do that. But
sure,
that's what we're called, to be disciples of Jesus. And I would argue that's what the New Testament is. It's not theology; it's actually pastoral.
Yes,
it's pastoral understanding of who God is. You're learning to imitate His character.
Yeah,
and Paul really gets that, I think, in ways that many don't. So.
I think that ultimately has got to be the best expression of truth, because, I find that quite often, I've fallen into this as well, is that truth then becomes what is found in a book, and in memorizing as much of this truth as I possibly can. So it becomes truth as fact. Whereas every time the Bible uses, or in the New Testament, particularly when it uses the word truth, it seems to be more about being faithful to live out or to flesh out, like Jesus is the fleshing out of Yahweh. We're also called to flesh out the word so that people around us can see what God is really like.
Absolutely. Now think about this. The Trinity. What's the usual symbol for the Trinity? It's a triangle, right?
Yep.
Where does that come from? The Bible has no diagrams. Well, who starts thinking about this? It's Greek Christians. And what lies at the start of their journey? They discovered that mathematics, the ideas of mathematics, are the one thing that don't change over time. So they really think in those terms. And can I suggest that's why some theology is so abstract? But what if the truth is not abstract? What if it's not an idea? What if the truth is actually personal? Because if you start with Yahweh, you're starting with a person. What if it's been a true person that defines truth? And that mathematics is one expression of a certain kind of truth, but it's not the pinnacle.
Yeah.
I think that's the biblical picture. It's just really the kind of people we are. And I wonder if that's part of the reason why Australians are not sure about Christians. Because a lot of us are kind of prats on occasion,
and I mean, it makes our job so much harder when people behave in that sort of way. Why do you think it is? Why do you think that the church has, how am I going to even ask this, given really a different message, given a message that often clouds our real message? Why do you think that is?
Well, it's a great question. Of course, the church is a huge, huge thing, right? I mean, we use this one word to describe this immense, diverse thing over 2 millennia. So here we go in 15 seconds. I think for me, the shorter answer is we've forgotten that this is about life. We think it's about good and evil, and it's not. It starts in Genesis with the creation, where God brings order out of this stuff that's formless, and he speaks life into that. Now, what if we thought of being Christian starting there and not with what's right and wrong, or am I good and bad?
Yeah.
What if I ask myself, what is going to bring life into this situation? Well, the only one who really knows that is God. That's why I want to look to Jesus and, okay, what would you do here? So, I think those what would Jesus do things, I mean, they've got a bit of stick over, over the years, but I think actually that's a pretty good question to ask.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and so I would say, for me, the measure of holiness, let's go to John's Gospel, for example. The word that comes up more often than anything else in John's Gospel is life, eternal life, over and over and over again. Of course, because God's the creator. He's the source of all life. So how about this for a definition of holiness? Do people feel more alive after I've been with them than before?
Wow. I love that.
Isn't it great? So you can stop being the moral policeman of the universe and you can bring life to people, which doesn't mean, yes, you'll have some things to say, like you need to stop this because it's actually killing you. But it's about bringing life to people. You want to bless them. Right? And I think that's really what's going on. And we've missed some of that, partly because some of us haven't really understood the grace of God, and being legalistic actually is a way of having power over people. You think about that medieval period, the threat of hell, and people have their own ways of doing this. It gives me a sense of superiority if I'm holier than you are, right? See, I don't do what you do in terms of I give this up and all that kind of stuff. It just changes the grammar of that discourse, I think.
I love that. I love that. And as you say, we start reading the Bible at Genesis 1 with life and creativity and vibrancy, instead of a message that starts at Genesis 3 with misery and sin and right and wrong and black and white and evil and all of that. So very good. I love that. David Perry is watching tonight, as is Ruth Miles from the Sunshine Coast. Hi to Anne Kelly, and also John Dubican. And John, you remember John and Sandra Dubican?
I remember John and Sandra. Oh, wonderful. Yeah. Hi, guys. Yeah.
And John says here, Rikk was a great drummer, played in 3 bands.
I had hair back then too.
You still got more than me, brother. So
far be it from me.
And Chris Prentice says that her husband Tom became a Christian through the God Squad.
Oh, right. Okay. That was a wonderful formative experience, I have to say, working with John. It was really
wonderful. Wonderful. So David Perry, he sent me an email during the week, Rick, and we'll just steer off course to what we've been chatting about and get to David's question. He is just kind of grappling through the whole aspect of what Jesus did on the cross in dying, and the whole, the wages of sin is death, and his thinking along the line of, when he thinks about his sin, or like the sin of his kids, for example, does anything that they do really warrant the death penalty, and especially eternal death? So, big question, I understand, but just your thoughts on that. What did Jesus actually accomplish?
This is a great question. It's a very serious question, right?
Yeah.
So how do you get to this, right? And this is the thing. It's really important, and I'm not necessarily great at doing this. I'm trying to learn to do it well. And this is not directed at David in particular. I say this of myself and to students and others who listen and in conversation. Every question we ask has to be framed. Right? You've got to use grammar and you choose words. Yeah. And that framing doesn't come out of anywhere. Usually there's some kind of presupposition that I know what the answer is. And my framing of the question puts it that way, right? So what if the issue is more like this? I had a friend, I do have a good friend in Sydney who had a party for his daughter many years ago, pardon me. And he has a bunch of non-Christian friends, and he prayed at the start of this. And later on, one of his non-Christian friends came up and, perhaps typically Australian, somewhat fortified against the moment by a few glasses of Shiraz. And he said to my friend, nice speech, referring to the prayer. And then he said, this God thing, he said, I'm just not sure it's going to make that much of a difference. He said, my parents brought me up to do this and to do that, and he gives, sizable amounts to charity, takes care of people, da 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 da. And he said, I just don't think this God thing is going to make me a better person. Now, I don't know, it's worth just stopping for a moment and thinking about what each of us would have said to that, right? Mm-hmm. Fortunately, my friend is not me. And he said to this guy, you're probably right. I'm not sure that necessarily you becoming a Christian is necessarily going to make you a better person. I don't think, in terms of goodness, but he said, but goodness is not the problem, is it? He said, because there's 40, 50, 60 years from now, you and I will both be 6 feet under, pushing up daisies and that. And I can tell you there's a lot of good people down there, and they're dead. He said, goodness is not the issue. The issue is death. And what Christians believe is that what Jesus is about is actually, if you trust him, taking you through death and bringing you out on the other side. Okay. So I think from the biblical point of view, and what you do with the Genesis stories, something went wrong from the very beginning that has touched us all. And then people try to explain that, original sin. I don't think that's a useful explanation. I think all Paul says is, listen, we know we're all in this because everybody dies.
Yeah.
Basically what it is, right? Everyone dies. So even if you didn't know what Adam did, someone somewhere has done something. And the answer is relational. And when Jesus is dying, he's particularly doing that in terms of being called to Israel. Of course, that will extend to the rest of us, but he quotes text from Isaiah and other places, and that's a discussion around that. But basically what he's doing, I think, in his death is restoring our relationship to God. I don't think Satan's involved in that at all. I don't think he's buying Satan off or anything like that. There's just purely this brokenness that exists between God and his creation, Israel, rest of humanity. And Jesus' death somehow deals with that. And so now there's the offer to life to anyone who's willing to come into a relationship with God. Right, so we're already in trouble. All of us are going to die. Right? That's something's happened. We don't know what it is, but you can see it all around us. No one's going to escape that. It's not what we were meant to do. And I think Israel's hope and the New Testament is, no, this is about life. And if you put your trust in Jesus, he's the one who can take you into that. So for me, it's less a matter of, at the end, God saying to all these dirty, rotten sinners, I'm going to burn you up and all of that. I think that's starting in the wrong place. I think what he's saying is, where you are now, you're in a mess.
Right.
I came in Jesus to resolve that, and I'm offering you life if you'll trust me.
You just made an interesting statement there, Rikk, and it's fascinating that you and you said it's not about paying off the devil. I was reading an article yesterday by this guy who's actually talking about that very same thing. He said that the only word that Jesus used about himself and the death that he was going to undergo was that he was giving his life as a ransom.
Yeah.
And he said a ransom is something that you pay to a kidnapper. And he said, we've all been taken hostage by the devil, and Jesus actually died on the cross to pay the ransom to the devil to set us free. I take it you disagree with that.
Well, I do agree with him emphasizing the language ransom. I really do. But then you have to put it into context. And what we have is, Satan is a robber. But that, I would argue or suggest that that's not the context in which Jesus uses it. So if I have any expertise, it's the area that has to deal with how the New Testament uses Israel's scriptures. Not to be precious, you'll notice I don't talk about the Old Testament. And the reason I do that is because Jesus never calls it that. Neither does Paul nor John, any of those who knew him best. So what am I doing innovating? They were the scriptures for him, so they're the scriptures for me, and the New Testament fulfills them. So in Israel's scriptures, and they're Israel, which means this is not an Australian thing, it's not an American or Canadian thing, this is a Jewish thing that's we've been grafted into. So, okay, that terminology. Well, when Jesus talks about his death as a ransom, I would argue, and it's debated, but I would argue that goes back to Isaiah chapter 53. And what's going on there is you've got what I think is a new exodus from Babylon. They had one from Egypt. And in Egypt, God was their kinsman redeemer. That's where their word redeemer comes from. It's part of that ransom discourse. But here's the interesting thing. Where does God ever pay Pharaoh to get Israel out?
No, I can think of. I think they paid Israel to go.
Exactly, right? Yeah. And if you come to Isaiah, the same language is used there. And scholars who looked at this, and I've done a bit of work in Isaiah, everyone recognizes you normally expect a ransom to be paid to someone. There is no someone in Isaiah either. In fact, Yahweh says, I didn't sell you into slavery because someone had some claim on me, and I'm certainly not paying anyone to get you back. You are mine. Right? So it's okay to hear the ransom language as long as you're hearing it, not in terms of some other context, but in terms of the context of Isaiah and the Exodus. And there God pays no one. So the ransom language is more about, I think, speaking of who Jesus is. He is our kinsman redeemer. That's more the issue that's at stake here.
Okay. Just go into a little bit of detail about the
we moved a little bit away from our topic, but that's okay.
Oh, that's fine. I knew you would go down, a few little rabbit holes on the way, which is they're all there fighting with.
Rabbits are my best friends.
That's right. Yeah. Tell us about the kinsman redeemer. What does that mean?
Okay, so what would happen in a situation where someone is in slavery? Someone would come along and buy them out. That's normally what their kinsman would do. That's a relational term, right? So this is Yahweh and Israel. So interestingly, the first entity called Son of God in the Bible is actually Israel. Right? Now you need to think about that later on, and that also occurs in Deuteronomy 30 to 32. It talks about God begetting Israel. So begotten language begins first with Israel.
Yeah.
Right? And then it's picked up with David, you're my son, I've begotten you. So if we won't have time to pursue this, but Son of God in the scriptures doesn't mean being God. It's always used by God when he's speaking of creation. So to say Jesus is divine because he's Son of God, I would argue, no, you're going down the wrong road here. That's not, it's the language Lord that identifies Jesus with Yahweh. But back to the kinsman redeemer, that's what Yahweh does. He becomes as father to Israel. And he redeems them. So the ransom language is deeply relational. So when Jesus says, I've come to give my life as a ransom, I'm not hearing that in transactional terms. I'm hearing that primarily in terms of, here is Yahweh among us, our kinsman redeemer, who will be father to us, right? So, and there's no other transaction going on. Satan doesn't receive anything. Neither did Pharaoh, neither did the kings of Babylon. It's just...
I'm so glad you clarified that, because when I read it, and I'm like, I know about this. It didn't ring true with me that God owed the devil anything and had to pay him off. So I'm really glad you mentioned that. There's a couple of comments here. Rachel said, Jesus is a fantastic example of a great leader. He came to serve, so great leaders are servants of others, to serve others' needs first. I agree with that, the whole servanthood. And, I wonder, have some church leaders missed that? When I look around some parts of the body of Christ, and it's more about the church serving the leader rather than the servant leader serving the church. You got any comments on that?
Well, I am kind of interested, really. Even the language leadership, it seems to have taken on a life of its own. And I understand, you've got to have a term somewhere. But I think for me, it's just learning to think carefully about what language we use. And I even wonder if leader is the right term to use. If it just...
What would you use?
Well, I'm going to go back and use some of the scriptural stuff that we have. Messiah is one. Right? So Jesus is the Messianic King. He's the only one who gets to be called Father. We have the language then of apostle or prophet or teacher or those kinds of things. You do hear about words that are translated bishop in the New Testament. They're nothing like the 3rd and 4th century AD bishops, who are a very different beast. So I'd rather stick with that kind of language, not to be, I really don't like this word because I think it's like a swear word these days, fundamentalist.
Yeah.
You use that word in kind of a bad pejorative. I don't think it's helpful. I don't think people necessarily know what it means, and it's not an argument, it's a label. So, but I think, Rob, the older I get, and I'm getting pretty old, the more I realise how little I understand. I'm not even sure I know what the right questions are. I was pretty sure I knew what they were when I was 25. Now I'm not so sure. And so I'll often say to students, listen, don't come with your questions to the Bible. You don't even know the right ones. Just sit down and listen first. Learn to hear the Bible in terms of what it's got to say, and then think about your questions in the light of that, rather than starting with yourself, start there. So it's that kind of thing. And it says, I'm not sure about the word leader. It's got so many connotations in our culture. Whatever you use the one that they use, we'll have to contextualize that, of course. That's back in the 1st century. You've got a bit of history there. But start with that and then work your way toward it. And,
okay.
Why don't you use language of diakonos, right? Minister, servant.
Yeah, servant.
Kind of thing. Yeah, why not just use that? Right?
I love the word among as well. When the New Testament is talking about the leaders, it's talking about people who are among the flock. Yeah. They're among the people. And I mean, that's something that's always been very dear to my heart, and I've preached in churches where, you're brought onto the platform after worship, and as soon as you finish preaching, you have an altar call, and you don't even get to pray for the people, and you're taken off into a green room. And there's part of me that just goes through this whole culture shock, because I'm like, I want to spend time with the people, not to be. I'm not a commodity to be whisked on and whisked off. It's foreign to me, as the people at Bayside well know.
Yeah, I think I don't know enough about that history, but I imagine part of it simply has to do with, and I'm sure you'd understand this too, right? People have come in, they might have flown in from somewhere, they might not have got over jet lag, and they're preaching 3 times on a Sunday, and they just need a bit of space. And we all know those folk who don't have very good boundaries. They'll be a limpet, So I get all of that.
Yes.
So I want to say yes, but ultimately I think, and even Jesus himself has to try and take off, but that doesn't work. He gets caught.
Never works.
For space, but I think the danger I would have to watch, I'm going to confess this here. So living in Australia, and most of my work in the past being overseas, I had a conference I went to every year in the UK. It took me 37 hours one way to get there.
Yeah.
Well, the point of that story is you soon rack up Qantas frequent flyer points, right? And then you're platinum, and guess what happens? You're about to take an international flight. You go into the international first class lounge, right? And suddenly I start to change. I start to think that here's Rikk, the great one, swanning into the lounge with all of these people serving him, right? And it never got me enough not to go in. But I just realized the way it can change you. Someone recently was very kind to us. They loaned us a late model Volvo to do some driving in. You know what I discovered? What? I started to look down on the Subaru drivers. That little thing. I thought, you arrogant. So I guess it's what people can handle and manage. But I think it's really important, the signals that we give to the world around us. So last little story, many years ago when I was attending Richmond Temple before we went overseas, I did a couple of nights, 2 weeks running on Jesus, 2 Wednesday nights. And on the second Wednesday, I'll never forget it, this guy came up to me and just given the way he was dressed and his hairstyle, clearly not a member of the church. And he said, I just need to shake your hand. And I said, well, okay, right. He said, I saw the car you drove up in. I know you believe this. And that was in a context when you might recall the government was giving ministers special car deals.
Yeah.
And I heard all kinds of stories from people who worked in those car yards, watching Christian leaders come in and getting the most souped up hot vehicle they could because they're getting a good deal. And it wasn't about being a minister, it was about getting a good deal and getting a really hot car. And, I don't have windows into people's souls, but I'm just saying how people who were not Christians saw that.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with having a good car, but if you're going to be involved in a very explicit way of being Christian, you might just want to think about what that says to the watching world in terms of what matters to us. I'm not saying you can have a nice car, but there's something in the gospel, that has to be.
Again, it's the way that we live truth, isn't it? So, I mean, I agree with you. I don't think it's a problem having a nice vehicle for anybody. Okay. In fact, it could be very good stewardship buying a decent.
Except maybe for me.
Oh, right. Yeah. But it comes back to self-awareness too, doesn't it? Like, you noticed that there was a sense of maybe pride or entitlement rising up on the inside of you, which then, of course, you could say, okay, this is not a part of me I like. Yeah. Holy Spirit, please, help me.
And it's just, can I just tell you a story here? Because I'm trying to work out what this means to truly be made in the image of God. And I'm just learning. I'm still in nappies, if you like, or diapers on the other side of the Pacific Ocean. I'm just trying to practice to learn what this meant. And I got myself in a terrible situation where I ended up flying out to New Zealand a few days apart. I had to come back. So it's just absolutely ridiculous. But so on that flight, the flight attendants, there are some people on flights who are not very nice. So I just thought, you know what? These people are made in God's image. I just need to treat them kindly. I know they're here to serve me, but I'm going to try and turn the tables on them. I'm just going to try that. They became my project, which in itself is a horrible way to think about them. Like I said at this beginning. So, just little things like when there's all this stuff going on and they come and say, oh, look, we've only got 2 choices. Look, it's okay. Give me the one that most people don't want. It's fine. And just, or I'd say, oh, Mr. Watts, you've got a little while for you drink. Don't worry about it, just when you're ready. And look, it doesn't cost me anything to say that. Right? Or if I get up and go to the back, I'd actually chat to them and say, how are you doing? How do you find the flight? And I just treat them as human beings, right? So I did that, and that was it. So then I'm going out to New Zealand again. It's a crazy situation. And I'm lined up to catch the plane, and the air crew comes by, and one of the attendants says, are you Rikk Watts? What's going on here? I said, yes. We heard about you from the other flight crew. And I said, oh, what? Yeah, we'll see you on board. I'm like, okay, what was that? So anyway, I get on board the plane and I'm just kind of settling down, ready for the flight. And one of the flight attendants comes up and says, so you're Rikk, is that right? I said, She said, I just want to say that everyone on that earlier flight was talking about how kind you were to people.
Beautiful.
The thing is, Rob, it cost me nothing.
Yeah.
And I'm not telling this story to make me look great. You only have to hang around me for a bit to realise that is a rare event. But it costs us nothing to be kind to people and to actually work on what does it mean to bring life to them.
Yeah.
Right? And people can see it. And I think that's where, what if holiness is about bringing God's life to people? There's no other life except his. Yeah. So how do I bring his life into a situation?
And it actually makes every day incredibly exciting, because you can go out today, let me find some ways that I can bring life to people. How I, I mean, when in John 1, where he's talking about the word becoming flesh and demonstrating unfailing love and faithfulness, or grace and truth, some of the older translations say. And that, you probably know this better than I do, but unfailing love is that which leans into other people to look for opportunities to be kind and gracious.
And I think too, Rob, it's I teach John, so that full of grace and truth. Many of us would argue that comes from Mount Sinai, where they just had the golden calf incident, and in that cultural world, everybody knew that Israel deserved to be dead meat, and there was no question. After what they'd done, that's what they deserved.
Yep.
And Moses goes up the mountain and he says, Yahweh, think about your reputation. And the Hebrew Bible is pretty clear. Yahweh changes his mind, which there are whole theological systems that start creaking and groaning at that point. The Hebrew Bible says he changed his mind, deal with it. Suck it up. That's what it says, okay? And on the basis of Moses, who knew something about God's character. Now, in Jeremiah, when Jeremiah comes to God, he says, listen, I don't care if Moses or Samuel stood before me. They're going to exile. This is not changing. This is relationship. It's not a matter of mathematics. And so that grace and truth comes from that moment after the golden calf incident, where God declares his name, the Lord, right? And then it's the grace and the truth. And, he shows covenant faithfulness to thousands of generations, but also judgment to the, third and fourth. That's a massive asymmetry. 1,000 on one side, it's the most extraordinary in the entire scriptures.
Yeah.
And the thing that I think need to remind myself of is people like kind people, but there are times when the truth has to be spoken.
Yeah.
And the question is, does it come across as born out of a deep love for and a concern about life, or is it simply a self-righteous thing? And it can still be strong. I mean, Paul's got some strong things. Jesus has some strong things to say. But it's not you become a wuss, right? And everything's just, it's different. There's something about it that is genuinely about life.
Yeah.
The true character of life that comes only from God, where he wants to bless people, but at the same time, he has some things to say to people like Pharaoh who think they can treat other people like dirt.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think what you do there is you don't lose either. You get both in full relief, where there's amazing, overwhelming emphasis on the grace. And you get that, right? Grace and then truth. And that's what we call the act of adultery, right? First of all, the grace, then the word of truth. And you've got to have both, otherwise I think both are meaningless. So.
Is this the articulating of truth when you really love someone is actually an act of true kindness? Because and I've had to speak all sorts of fairly blunt words to people over the years, but if they know that it's ultimately because I have their best interest at heart, that I love them, that I'm not just speaking the truth in love as some kind of platitude to justify me dumping the word of God on them. You know what I mean? It's that I've earned the right to be heard in their life, that they know I've got their best interest, and my expression of coming alongside them and giving them maybe some hard truth is actually an expression of ultimate kindness and love.
Yeah, and that's why I think, for me at least, seeing the truth not as abstract. I mean, in the Hellenistic world, where they're really asking about this, I mean, no one can trust their gods. I mean, look at Homer's gods. Oh my goodness, and they try to Photoshop them to improve them. But in the end, the only truth they really have is what they come up with their own rationality, right? With those original mathematical origins and all the abstraction and the impersonality, is that the right word, that goes along with it?
Yeah.
So I think it's a really important discipline for me to keep reminding myself that truth is ultimately personal, which means any discourse around truth has got to keep in mind that it's fundamentally personal. And that will come back to character. And that's one of the things we were going to get to at the end of tonight. I think the reason the modern world's in such a mess, in spite of all the freedom we've been given, is we don't exercise those freedoms in ways that are keeping with God's character.
Well, let's talk about that. We've got 5 minutes left The hour always goes incredibly fast. So
Sorry.
why don't you flesh that out for us?
Okay, so I'm actually, for those listening and for you obviously, I'm convinced that the 21st century is probably the most Christian the world has ever seen. But that's because I see some things that Christianity gave that I wasn't really aware of when I was younger. Like, first of all, the gift of change, that's possible.
Yeah.
And that change can actually be a good thing. That's not really part of the ancient world. If the world changes, you can't know it through philosophy. You've got to know it through the senses and testing, which is how they encounter Yahweh at Mount Sinai. Go back and read how often seeing and hearing occurs through those texts. That's why you get 4 Gospels. They're seeing, they're hearing, they're touching, they're handling, which is basically the way we do science. You don't learn about the world by guessing what it's going to be like rationally. Oh, this makes sense, therefore it must be true. Just a little footnote here. That's a couple of Israeli scholars have pointed out this is one of the most prominent pitfalls in human thinking. If it sounds reasonable, we think it's true. That is simply not the case. Where's your evidence? Where are the facts? That's what you've got to look at. And that's what you constantly get in the scriptures. And the 4 Gospels are about that. Jesus right in front of you, touching, seeing, handling. So that's how you know. Second thing, cities are meant to be dynamic. They're not fixed hierarchies. You can't tell somebody's gifts from their gender, their skin color, their social status. You can't do that. Right? In Christ, that doesn't matter anymore. The body's not the enemy, which many people thought it was in the ancient world, a prison that kind of trapped the soul. No, not at all. You can't be human without a body. And love and compassion really matter. No one really believed that in antiquity. That's primarily a Christian contribution. Well, you have those things, and I would say, if you look at, say, I've said this in China, compare the Ming Dynasty to modern China, and then compare both of those to the scriptures, people are astonished. China's far more Christian than anything else, actually, in terms of those big categories, even if they don't have much room for the guy who gave them all those categories.
Yeah.
So if you've got this freedom, this is where the point comes now. Designers, and I really like to think about design, I'm not very good at it, but I'm interested. They will tell us that every design choice reflects your character. So here's a scary thought. A designer can walk into our homes and read our character off what's going on in those homes. Even more scary, people can walk into our churches and read the character of our church off what goes on in those churches.
Yeah, so true.
Right? Are we a community, or are we minions under the Great One? What's all going on there? I don't know, just interesting to think about.
Yeah.
Well, if that's the case, I think what's happened is we have incredible freedom in the modern world because of the gospel. All the more important to imitate the character of Yahweh or Jesus among us, because that's the only way we can handle this freedom that will bring life to people.
Yeah.
And we're not doing that, right? We're doing our own thing, being vindictive, arrogant, pursuing our own agendas, and that creates terrible trouble. So the only thing for me, I just keep saying this to my students, right? The thing that really matters most is character.
Yeah.
And character doesn't come through willpower.
Tell me a bit more about that.
Yeah, character comes through being filled with the Spirit.
Yeah.
Paul, it's God who puts within us both the willing and the to-doing. It's not a matter of just willpower at all. In fact, I don't see where the Bible ever says try harder.
No, so it's true.
Be filled with the Spirit, right? And of course, the Spirit is about those gifts and graces. Yes, there are powerful gifts, but there's an awful lot of stuff about character.
Yeah. Forbearance,
love, right? That's critical, I think. So, yeah, I keep saying to them, I just preached this in church the other day, folks, is just every morning ask God to fill you with His Spirit.
Yes.
Because the only way you're going to truly end up looking like Him, and in which all this freedom will bring the life God intended it to.
Yeah, wonderful. I love that. As my prayer every morning, Lord, I am filled with the Spirit, and I'm open for business.
Yep.
Rikk, we could chat all night, but our time is up. But I will give you some grace when you move to Vancouver, just to settle in, and I'll get in touch with you and invite you to come and be a guest again with me on another Tuesday night.
Thanks. Absolutely. Good to see you, mate.
Good to see you too. God bless you heaps.
Great.
Lovely to have Dr. Rikk Watts on Tuesday Night Live tonight. What a wonderful man, and so much to bring. I feel like we've only just kind of scratched the surface of a few things tonight, but I hope you've gleaned a lot from that. I think his definition of holiness, I feel, you know, maybe I'll unpack that a little bit more in a blog or something, just to really bring some inspiration to people through that. But wonderful. Thank you so much for connecting. Thank you for all your comments. I'll go through the comments, and I think I've just seen a few questions that will pop in there as well. I've got Shane Willard back with me next Tuesday night, 8 o'clock. So I'll post some of those questions to Shane. If you've got any questions that you'd like me to put to Shane, feel free to message me during the week. Facebook Messenger is probably the best way to communicate. Or my email is rbuckingham@baysidechurch.com.au. Have a wonderful week. Stay safe. Be filled with the Spirit, and look for ways to reflect the holiness, the goodness, the kindness of God to other people. Good night.